Okay, so this is video 5 in a free 9-part series on how to prepare a response to your first RFT. In this video, I cover the key points of what you need to do when you're actually writing a response. When you're just starting out, it's really hard to know what to write when you're responding to these sorts of documents, RFTs, RFQs. And so it's worth remembering that when you're responding to an RFT, it's not about you. It's not about how you are going to position yourself and what you're going to tell the buyer about you. It's all about the buyer and what it is that they are wanting, what they've gone out to the market to purchase. And it's about how well you are going to meet their requirements. How you're going to be a low-risk provider and you're going to offer value for money. So it's a different mindset, and it's a mindset that I don't see very often when I'm reading tenders that are written by people who've never been on the other side. So I'm going to give you a bit of a look on the other side and how tenders are actually evaluated. So I'm going to use as my example this sample RFT that I've written, and I've also written a sample response, and I've also prepared an evaluation handbook which mimics the process that a buyer goes through. Mature buyers use this formal process. Buyers that are less mature may not use a documented process, but believe me, they still use this process in their head. So what they do is they point score each of the evaluation criteria. They all use different point systems, maybe out of 5 or a 7 or a 9 or even a 10. And the way to start evaluating is to look at the response to a requirement that you've asked of the tenderer, and immediately you start at the midpoint. So in this case, the midpoint is a 5, and a 5 means you met the requirements. You've given them what they've asked for. They're reasonably confident that you understand the requirements. You'll complete the work to a reasonable standard. You're not great. You're not terrible. You're an okay supplier. You don't want a 5 out of 9. You want a 9 out of 9. A 9 out of 9 means that the evaluation panel is completely confident that you understand the requirements and that you'll do the work to a very high standard. In other words, you exceed the requirements, and that represents a safer, low-risk purchase for them and better value for money. So you're after a 9 out of 9. Now what they do is, first of all, someone will go through the document and they will check the compliance criteria. And it's a yes-no response. You've either complied or you haven't. That's why it's called compliance criteria. And you don't get to the second gate if you don't make it through this gate. So if you don't comply with anything, they'll use that as an opportunity to strike you out. Sometimes you're allowed through that gate because it wasn't a showstopper, but if it's a showstopper, this is the shortlisting process that you have to go through. The next thing is they then point score each of the evaluation criteria. In this case, if they have published the weightings. It helps when they do that because it focuses you on the ones that are the most important. They give you a score out of 10 or 100, and then they compare your score to everybody else's. Sometimes price is weighted, so you get a score for the price as well. And the way that they score them is they document in a big list everything that they've asked you to provide, every little piece of information that they've asked for. And that's why it's really important that your response is produced in using headings that are in the same order as the evaluation criteria or the headings that they've given you, because they use their document to produce this score sheet, And it makes it very, very easy for them if you've given them a response that's back in the same order, because then there's no hunting around looking for information. You would not believe how many suppliers ignore that one simple concept. Now, if we go to the request document itself, so this is the request document. I'm just going to go back here. This is the statement of requirements. So they've spent a bit of time figuring out what they want. This is what it is that you're going to be providing to them. You may notice that there is some strange requests in there, and you think, well, that's a really poor way of doing it, or that's really dumb. But that's the way they want it. So it's not about you and how you think you should provide the work. If they've asked for it to be done in a particular way, my advice is that you honour that, you respond to that, and then argue the toss later when you've got the contract. Then you can recommend better ways of doing it. Alternatively, you could submit an alternate tender as well. If there are strange things where you go, that's really weird, or I wonder why they've asked for that, chances are they've been burnt in the past. So the evaluation criteria is a risk management or a risk mitigation tool used by buyers. So they try and weed out the poor suppliers by ensuring that the evaluation criteria pick up anyone who has who can't demonstrate that they're going to do the work. So this is they tend to follow a structured format if they're done well, and then there is a response schedule. In this particular instance, if there's no response schedule, then, as I said before, you go straight back to the evaluation criteria and you write your responses against those evaluation criteria. For this reason, because their evaluation criteria will be in a score sheet in the order that they're in the document. So here's my evaluation, my example tender response. What should jump out immediately to you is that up until the point where we've got attachments, it's 62 pages long. And it needs to be 62 pages long because they've asked for a lot of information. And those 62 pages is our justification for why they should pick us. It's our attempt to persuade them that we are the best at providing exactly the sort of services that they're asking for, or providing exactly this sort of goods, whatever. And then there's a group of much of attachments or appendices. Some of these appendices is information that they've asked for example, insurance certificates. They've asked you to attach the insurance certificates, and in the document they've also asked for CV under organisational capability. Awards 1, obviously they've not asked for you to tell them what awards you've won, but if you've won awards, tell them, because that's part of your demonstrated capability, because you've been judged by your peers and found to be excellent. So absolutely find a place to put your awards and any other bragging rights that you may have into a section and tie it back to organisational capability or demonstrated understanding or some other criteria that's relevant. The other thing that I wanted to point out is you'll often be asked to comment on the draft contract. This is how I tend to do it. The point here is a confused brain won't buy. There must be no ambiguity in what you're offering. And in this particular case, they've asked for, they say, where an offer does not comply with a particular clause, you need to state it. There's some instructions in here. So I've gone through the contract, I've listed every single clause, and I've told them whether we understand and agree it or not. And that way there's no ambiguity. So you can see I've gone through the entire contract. Now, in this case, we understood and agreed with everything and we complied with everything. Yeah, you could shorten that up into we understand and agree with the whole contract. That's equally as unambiguous. The other thing that I wanted to point out is in the description, they sometimes put in a checklist. If they've asked you to supply various bits and pieces. The whole document must be navigable. They must be able to find everything really easily, which means that you have numbers on the headings, and those numbers should tie back to their numbers, or at the very least be in the same order. You have numbers on page numbers on every page. I like to put this breadcrumb up the top. This reminds them what particular criteria they're scoring at this point in time. And in this case, they've asked for cash flow. And so I like to show them exactly where the cash flow is. If I was to click on that, it takes them straight to financial capacity. And there's an example of cash flow. Interesting point. If you are a small business, you're not a publicly listed business, there is no obligation for you to supply your financials to anybody. If you're a publicly listed business, obviously, yes, you have legislative requirements. It's none of their business what your profit is. They have no business asking you that. So if they get too intrusive, then you can go back to them and say, hey, as a small business, I'm not obliged to provide audited accounts at the end of each year. Could I get a letter from my accountant attesting to my solvency? Because at the end of the day, that's their only concern. Sometimes they like to see what your turnover is because of a point that I made in a previous video. If you are too small and you are biting off more than you can chew, and the value of this contract is worth more than about 30% of your gross annual turnover, then they may deem you to be too small and underprepared and lacking the essential business foundations. Let's go back to the response schedules. We've talked about a number of these in the past. Now, I just want to show you something. Qualitative criteria. Okay, so here's organizational capability and capacity. So they're two very different terms. They mean two very different things, but they're closely related. Capability means, are you able to do the work? Do you have the necessary resources and knowledge and skills and attitudes and people within your company? And capacity means, even if you have all of that, do you have the spare capacity, the bandwidth to take on this extra work? This evaluation criteria stems from a position of risk where you don't have the people, you don't have the expertise and experience within your company, and you're intending to recruit it for the sole purpose of doing this work. That never ends well, because what happens is the company comes in with newbies. They've never worked together before. They don't have systems for that specific piece of work, and they crash and burn. And the start is very shaky because there's also a learning curve. Whereas if you've got top-notch people who are experienced, have done this, and they've worked as a team, and you've got internal business management systems, that's a much, much lower risk purchase for the buyer. So let me show you how I have responded to this. So they have asked for resumes detailing the skills and experience. Bear in mind, a resume is a summary. That's basically what the word means, of the curriculum vitae. Curriculum vitae is the story of that person's working life, whereas a resume is a relevant summary. I have created a response. They've asked for, quickly go back, name and phone number, position, responsibilities, relevant qualities, and length of service. They like to know the length of service because they like to know that you are you have loyal employees. If you have a low staff turnover, you should totally tell them that. They also want to know the names of persons responsible for contract safety and QA performance. Now, interestingly, you would be shocked at how badly people respond to these sorts of questions. if they may not put this information in, or they might not provide resumes, or they don't put the full list of people in, and all that does is it fails to impress. And if there is a evaluation criteria against it, you don't want a 0 in any one of these boxes, and you will get a 0 if you don't answer that question. And that 0 will drag down your total weighted score. So even a 3 is better than a 0. So if you don't know how to answer something, just do your best. Don't make anything up, obviously, because this is a legally binding formal offer, what you're drafting here. So don't lie. I strongly advise against that. But here's how I have responded to this. I've also said that their curricula vitae are in Appendix 3. I'm giving them a CV because it's more detailed. However, don't make them 10-page long CVs, 1 to 2 pages max, preferably 1 page. The company, so respond to everything. The company reserves the right to interview these people during the tender discussion. Notice how I have made their questions a different colour. Agreed and understood. We welcome the opportunity to showcase our loyal staff. This sentence here, remember I talked about how you have to present yourselves as keen and friendly and flexible. This is a keen, friendly, flexible statement. Going back, they've also asked for financial capacity. They want that. Don't just think, oh, that's none of their business, I'm not giving that information. If you do that, you do it at your own peril. Call them or write to them and say, we don't want to provide this information. What can we provide you with to demonstrate our solvency? But look, at the end of the day, they only want to know this so that they know that you are a low-risk supplier. Current commitments. So this is how I have responded to current commitments. They want your top 10 clients, including the percentage of annual turnover. And there it is. Oops. There it is. Here it is. Client. And look, this is an example, so obviously I can't reveal anyone's details. That would be a breach of confidentiality, and I have made this entire document up, so my creativity ends at dreaming up company names that aren't real company names. I apologise for that. So that's how I've responded to that. There's the 10, and then they can see that you haven't got all your eggs in one basket. You've got a nice spread of contracts, and that gives them comfort that should you lose one of those contracts, you're not going to be scrambling to replace a massive chunk of your revenue. You will also notice that I've put in little testimonials. Testimonials are kind of cute. The eye is drawn to it, and if you want to boast about yourself, then use statements provided by others. The most powerful piece of information is what someone else says about you. So point is, answer every one of these boxes. Technical capability. Now, the reason why they're asking that is because they want to know that you have all of the technical issues, the people, the processes, the facilities, the systems in place, and that you operate a seamless, well-managed, well-run business. So just quickly, technical capability, I've responded to that. Where is it? Here. They wanted a supply chain, processes and facilities. So the point is, this is our supply chain flow. These are our suppliers. This is how we procure, and so on. This is our storage facility. So you can see that this is a pretty detailed description of how well run we are. And that's all they want out of these. And make sure that none of this is blah, blah. Make sure that this is all reassuring them that you're a low-risk supplier. Past performance and relevant experience, that's a bit of a no-brainer. They always ask for relevant or demonstrated experience. The most powerful indicator of what kind of a supplier you are is what you've done in the past and what others have said about you in those jobs. So there's a saying, you're only as good as your last few jobs. So make sure that your relevant experience is somewhat recent. And they also want to know, where you've done this work. It's a very common tactic by large businesses. If they've got some relevant experience in another state, they'll use that. And that's a bit disingenuous in my mind, because the people, unless the people you're putting into this job were involved, then it's kind of not relevant, especially if the branch in the other state is under somewhat independent management. So you may, if you're scrambling, if you've got someone within your organisation who has specific experience and it's very niche experience, but it was with another company, then tell them that. Just say, this person is going to be working on this job, and this is the sort of thing that they've done in the past. Even if it wasn't you and your company, it was still someone within the cohort who's going to be working on that job. Demonstrated understanding and methodology is sometimes used. The thing about demonstrated understanding is that you have to demonstrate that you understand the requirements. And the easiest way to do that is to show that you understand the requirements because you've done that exact job somewhere else. But they may also want to know your methodology of how you're going to go about transitioning in, servicing the contract, dealing with issues and that kind of thing, how you're going to organise yourself. So depending on how detailed their requirement of information is, so they've asked for some very specific stuff, which makes it really easy, because basically you just go, okay, the tenderer is to provide a proposed method statement. Okay, they want a proposed method statement describing its philosophy for the execution of the works, including information such as, but not limited to. This is your opportunity to get a 9 out of 9, guys, because they've only asked for 4 things. But if you give them 9 things that are really, really relevant, then that's a 9 out of 9. If you just give them these 4, then that's a 5. Management plans, they like to see an example of the management plans that you've used elsewhere. Now, the thing about management plans is that if you have no idea how to produce them, then you have no idea. You'll start work and then you'll spend the next 12 months negotiating your management plans, and they'll all be rolling their eyes. So they need to see examples in the tender. And if they've asked for an example, spend a bit of time and tailor it to this piece of work. Make it as relevant as you can. Actually make it a draft, not an example. Sometimes there's an EMP questionnaire, and sometimes they're not even relevant. They're boilerplate template stuff. So, be patient. If it's not relevant, just say not applicable to this scope. So that's the plans. Now, local content. Hey, local content is money for jam. Basically, what they're asking for here is, if we give you this piece of work in this part of the world, how are you going to be good corporate citizens, and how are you going to support the locals? There's only 2 ways you can support the locals, really. You can employ them, or you can buy things off them. So you can contribute financially to the local economy by buying houses, by setting up an office, by employing locals where possible. by training the locals and developing them in that way. So have a bit of a brainstorm session. This tends not to be worth very much, but if you get this done well, then it's a 5 out of this is worth 5%. So you'll get the full 5% by doing that. Then a word about the quantitative requirements, aka pricing. So they've asked, in this case, they want accommodation requirements. So this means that you actually have to have a plan for how you're going to implement the business. Here's what wins, guys. It's how well you've demonstrated that you've thought about this work and how well and how you're going to do the work or provide the services. So you actually need to do some thinking and a plan, which you need to do if you're going to price it properly anyway, and present it as, and that tells them that you are keen. They like companies who are keen to work with them. And, think about what if you walk into a shop and the shop assistant is disinterested, then I'm tempted to walk out. I think, well, if you don't want my business, then blow you. Same in the tendering. If you don't come across as keen, if you come across as arrogant, it's a bit of a turn off, a bit of a disappointment, and then you won't win. Now, the pricing model, my advice, don't mess with their pricing model. If they've costed things differently to how you normally cost things, don't mess with that. Give it to them the way they've costed it. If you think there's a better way of pricing it, you can then add some alternate pricing. You may want to give them a whole of business discount or early payment discounts. You might want to say, well, this bit that you've specified here, let's say travel. Travel is, in our case, there's no travel, so it's free. So tell them the bits that you value adds for you, don't stay silent on them. Put them in and give them a 0 value so they can see what else they're getting for free. Okay, so that's the end of this section. I hope that's been a help. And if you want to know more, then I'll have some more advanced courses coming fairly shortly. Thanks for listening.